到大家真係好啦。咁多謝大家嚟我哋Docent Training嘅今日第一堂啦。咁我哋咧眨下眼咧，又真係做咗好多個展覽啦。咁我哋今次個展覽咧好特別嘅。咁展覽咧就有兩個 Curator 一齊去合作咧去做呢個展覽啦。大家見到個名對位練就嘢口用招呼，但係呢兩個係 artist 嘅。咁我哋今日咧第一堂一如以往咧，我哋都係會做一個簡單嘅 exhibition 嘅 overall 嘅簡介啦，咁會介紹呢兩個藝術家啦，咁亦都會有多啲關於呢個展覽嘅 exhibition design 嘅嘢，會同大家去分享嘅。咁喺開始之前咧，咁就想同大家咧高呼一次咧，你手頭上邊咧有唔同嘅資料嘅，咁包括有今日嘅 PowerPoint 啦嘅廣告啦。咁跟住咧會有兩份咧，就係 curatorial statement 嚟嘅，咁就會係有兩條橫間線咁樣嘅，係啦，咁樣有兩個 curator 一齊去做個展覽啦，咁就會有兩個 curatorial statement 啦，會有 object list 啦，一個草嘅 table 咁樣嘅啦。跟住咧會有兩份 work description 嘅，你見到頂頭上面有寫住，一個咧係個Noguchis Work， 另一個係個 Yale 嘅 works 兩份，有啲數字喺出嚟。咁亦都會有 floor plan 啦，一張 A4 紙嘅 floor plan。咁最後咧好緊要嘅，有一張咧類似一個 keywords notes 嘅，咁咧呢張工作紙咁樣啦，就俾大家咧一路聽書嘅時候咧，咁你可能有記低一啲重點嘅嘢嘅。咁隔離咧又分咗4個 keywords 嘅，咁包括係一啲唔同嘅藝術家嘅聯繫啦，有藝術嘅行為啦 ，artistic practice 啦，有 object 嘅materiality 啦。同埋一個 cosmopolitan view， 咁主要我哋成個展覽其實都圍繞呢幾個重要嘅詞語咧去出發嘅。咁都有幾點咧，就係俾咗少少例子其實呢個展覽係講啲咩嘅咧咁樣。咁大家咧你諗起嘅嘢咧，其實可以 mark 低入邊。有啲咩問題或者一啲重點你喺度聽嘅時候可以 mark 低嘅。咁我哋最後嘅時候咧，都會有一個環節咧，就俾大家你有啲咩問題想問 Curator 嘅咧，咁咧就藉住嗰個時間咧去問啦。好 ，so 如果大家有嘢漏嘅話咧，咁陣間可能完咗之後咧，可以喺 reception 可以補翻啦。如果漏嘅話，好，咁跟住咧，我哋就邀請我哋嘅偉大嘅Curator Okay. Okay, so I would like to introduce Doryun to share our today's lesson for us. And yeah, I think everyone knows him. If you don't, Doryun is over there. Okay, so Doryun is our chief curator in Ampus. He's also the curator for this exhibition. So today I would like to invite him to share this exhibition for us. So,
I don't know what you said exactly or how you said it, and the people are just laughing at my name. So good evening, everybody. It's always nice to be at Docent trainings and seeing the committed group of people, committed to learning, committed to visual culture, committed to sharing your passion and knowledge with our ever-expanding community and audience. So I know that it's at the end of a long working day, so I don't want to just talk on and on and on. I would just give you a general overview of the more conceptual architecture, as well as how the exhibition came about, how it is organized. I will try to go into as much detail as possible, but I don't want to be bogged down by the details in this first introductory training for the docents, because because you were just given a lot of information, so you also need time to read the digest. And there are going to be a couple of sessions following, as you know, which you are encouraged, maybe obligated to attend. But anyway, just to start off, so let's jump right in. Nixon talked about this very special exhibition. Of course, every single exhibition is like a child. We can't say that some of the exhibitions are more favorite than others. But this exhibition is indeed different and special than what had come before at the M+ Pavilion, where you can even say all the exhibitions that we have organized at M+. So this is going to be the 8th exhibition at the M+ Pavilion. Before that, we had already organized a dozen exhibitions as part of the Mobile M+ exhibition series. I think some of you were there already as a docent. There are several things that makes this exhibition different from what had come before. Most of our exhibitions up to this point have been group exhibitions, many of them organized around the growing and evolving multidisciplinary collections at M+. So if you look back, sorry if I'm stating the obvious, but it's always good to remind ourselves of the history of exhibitions at M+ as well. There were, for instance, examples of shifting objectives, which highlighted the design aspect of the collection. There was weight of likeness, which highlighted the ink art in the M+ collection. And sometimes we do solo projects, but they have all been Hong Kong artists. As you know, we have been representing Hong Kong in the Venice Biennale in the last 3 editions. We brought Li Kit in 2013, Zhang Qinghua in 2015, and Samson Young in 2017. And after each Venice presentation, we always do a Hong Kong return exhibition. So this has been also a very important strand of our exhibition program as well. What we haven't done so much, or at all, is a 1-person or 2-person exhibition of artists from other parts of the world. So that's perhaps the first thing that makes this exhibition special. I suspect that many of you know the name of Noguchi, Japanese-American artist, one of the major artists of the 20th century modern art history. He passed away in 1988 at the age of 86. Yangbo, so this is one of the important factoids that you have to remember, even though it's pronounced, written as D-A-N-H, it's pronounced Yan or Yang, as if D is Y, and this is from Vietnamese spelling. So yeah, these 2 artists who are coming from 2 totally different generations, 2 different historical contexts, 2 artists who had never met. Yan would be, sort of, in terms of age, Noguchi's grandson. And bring them together through the concept of Counterpoint, which I will explain later. So again, these 2 artists who are coming from different parts of the world, presented together is a new kind of an exhibition format that we are trying in the history of M+ exhibitions. There are some other curatorial, intellectual, institutional reasons why we wanted to do this, and I will hopefully explicate this as this talk goes along. I really see Noguchi, I just now mentioned that one of the major artists of the 20th century modern art, but really compared to many of his contemporaries, is someone really embodied the ideal of internationalism. Modern art as a language that transcends national boundaries and cultural boundaries as well. And Yangbo, being a 21st century artist, and in a world that is increasingly more and more troubled and fractured, someone who represents, not in a loud way, but quietly through his own work and practice, embodying the ideal of cosmopolitanism, the ideal of being a world citizen. So in that sense, I wanted to connect these 2 figures as representing 2 centuries. As as not as a contrast or binary, but as a connection, two ideals that I believe are still very important for us, especially those of us who care about culture. Two ideals that we really need to hold dear. And I think this is very much in line with the mission of M+ as a museum of visual culture of 20th and 21st century, looking out onto the world from the vantage point of Hong Kong, always connecting here and the rest of the world. And so, and then another, like this is a very long list already at the top of the introduction, but another sort of special aspect about this exhibition is for the first time we are collaborating with another major institution. Something that a large museum or any museum like M+ will do. Once we open the door, we'll be collaborating with many organizations, many museums of different kinds and different scales in different parts of the world all the time, co-organizing exhibitions or touring exhibitions, loaning from each other's collections. We haven't done that so much to date because we're in the stage of growing. But after having done almost 20 exhibitions, we felt that it's time to try working with another museum. So that museum here is the Noguchi Garden Museum in New York. In short, also called the Noguchi Museum, a museum that is dedicated to the work and legacy of Noguchi. Okay, so before I start the slideshow and the discussion, I guess I should say something about this very pretty but rather mysterious image. So this is the main image that we decided to use as our visual identity. From institutional but also design perspective, it is always a challenging thing when you do two-person exhibition because it's hard to choose just one work by one artist. But then often when you put two works, one by each artist, the design often comes out very badly and it doesn't have the impact. So what we decided to do is to ask Jan to take a picture of his own domestic elements. So this is actually, this is a secret that you don't have to share with your audience necessarily. One of his sort of beautiful arrangements that he has in his apartment in Berlin. An African coffee table, I guess, sort of table, with all these little toys that he has collected, which are actually sold by museums that show Noguchi's work, or I think there are all Japanese toy companies that somehow are inspired by Noguchi's work. I will specifically point out this form, this undulating donut form, which we will come back later. So it's a kind of oblique or poetic and subtle way of suggesting the relationship between these two artists. And that also, in a kind of sort of subconscious way, the decision why we decided to title the exhibition this way. It is not Isamu Noguchi and Yang Bo. It is Isamu Noguchi for Yang Bo. So in English, there's it can be read in multiple ways, and that's intentional. In Chinese translation, it doesn't quite capture that, but we also try to make the translation a bit ambiguous as well. Okay, so that's a very long introduction. I've given you some of the curatorial intellectual rationales as well as institutional motivations for doing this particular exhibition. But if you allow me for a few minutes, perhaps I could be a little bit personal about my own interest and I guess investment in the work of these two artists, because of course as a curator, even if you're working for an institution, there is always a certain preference or personal commitment that you bring to your choice of artists and the kinds of work. So as an American educated and trained art historian and a curator, Isamu Noguchi's life and work was very instructional when I was a student in university, but also in graduate school. And I will go on to talking about his biography a little bit more in depth. But someone who was biracial, bicultural, he was born to a Japanese father and American mother, Irish-American mother, born out of wedlock. His parents never got married. He spent the first about 10 years of his childhood in Japan, and then came back to the U.S. Without his father or without his mother. So, his life really starts with quite, sort of dramatic fashion of being split between two radically different cultures. And we're not talking about now, we're talking about 100 years ago. So the relationship between these two cultures were even farther than what they are now. So someone who, we can't even imagine what it's like to live as a biracial person in the United States. This is before the whole civil rights and all of these things with the Japanese name. But at the center of modern art in New York, starting from the 1940s until his death in the 1980s. So that is a really fierce life that he had to live. So as a young art historian and curator who was sort of studying American but also international modern art history, Noguchi was an odd man out. He was an exception, but he also embodied so many things that other major artists who are his contemporaries, let's say, think about de Kooning or Alexander Calder or Arshio Gorky, these abstract expressionist artists of the mid-20th century are exactly his contemporary. He was friends with all of these people, but his life had a completely different trajectory. So being ultimately American, but being not really American and more than American was something that was very interesting to me. Yambo has a different kind of unique biography, similarly, but in different ways, a biography of displacement. As you can guess from his name, he's of Vietnamese origin, born in 1975, so he's just in his early 40s. When he was 4 years old, his family fled Vietnam as part of the waves of refugees, so-called boat people. They were picked up by a Danish container ship out in the open sea, and they were deposited in refugee processing center in Singapore. From then on, they immigrated. They were allowed to go to Denmark, where he was raised and grew up. So ethnically and culturally Vietnamese, he also speaks still Vietnamese with his family, but really it's a game, as you wouldn't imagine. So somebody really whose identity is very much shaped by the experience of displacement at the beginning, but not seeing himself as a victim or a marginalized being. So both of these figures in many ways resonated with me as an intellectual level, in addition to their work resonating with me on a curatorial and professional level. So that's really sort of an honest explanation of why I started thinking about these two artists. But it's not just two of my favorite artists, there's more reason which I will get to a bit later. Okay, but I think it's important to look into each of these artists separately before we go on to the relationship between the two artists and why this exhibition brings the two artists together. So I'm showing you a collage of biographical photos, or rather say that's a weird word, of portraits of Isamu Noguchi at different moments in his life, actually several of them. One is my okay. So this will be around the 1930s. He's standing in front of one of his major public commissions that he got, which is still there when you go to New York. Then you go to the Rockefeller Center in Midtown. Then there is the entrance to AP, Associated Press, office building, and this aluminum cast sculpture hangs above the entrance to the AP building. These are a couple of images of Noguchi in his studio in downtown New York. This will be around, both of them will be around 1940s. He came to a breakthrough with the so-called slate sculptures. And he would take these flat pieces of marble or slate, and then without any joinery, without welding or without rivets or nails or screws, created this amazing surrealistic sculpture that can be assembled to stand on their own. This was a breakthrough moment in his career in the 1940s. This will be around early 1950s when he renewed his connection to Japan, and then was married to a very important, or a very famous Japanese actress who was herself a very fascinating figure. Someone, maybe it's too gossiping, but it's actually very interesting. Someone named Yoshiko Yamaguchi, who was born in Manchuria during the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, I think, when Japan was occupying Manchuria. She, in fact, had a Chinese name and became a film star towards the final years of Japanese occupation. She was detained at the end of the war, couldn't go back to Japan because she was suspected to be a spy. Finally, she could return to Japan and became a huge movie star, so big that she also had a Hollywood career known as Shirley Yamaguchi. So when these two people were married, it was marriage of stars. So Noguchi had that sort of glamorous aspect as well, both in American cultural scene as well as Japanese post-war cultural scene. And here, Noguchi, towards the end of his life, this would be about, I would say, mid to late 1980s, standing in his own museum in Queens, New York, just after the museum was established. But really, as I was saying, a major moment, of course, or a major force in Noguchi's life is undoubtedly being bicultural and biracial. I already said that he was born to a Japanese father, who was a very important poet, in fact, someone named Noguchi. Spent some time in the United States. Is also credited as introducing haiku to the American audience. Met Noguchi's mother, who was educated, at Bryn Mawr College and wanted to be a writer, but sadly a bit of a frustrated writer. So Noguchi was born out of wedlock between the Japanese father and the American mother, and then I said that he spent the first 10 years, from age 2 to 13, in Japan because he and his mother were summoned by his father, who still didn't marry his mother. He got married to a Japanese woman and a separate family. So there was again that sort of resentment that he held towards his father, which lasted for a long time. So I'm actually showing you pictures of Noguchi back in Japan in the 1950s, but there are many other sort of fascinating biographical moments in between that childhood. So then he goes back at the age of 13 to the US by himself. Then he went on to go to Columbia University as a pre-med student, like all Asian kids who have to study pre-medicine. But dropped out after 1 year to study sculpture, and then the rest is history. In the 1930s, we don't have an image here, but in the 1930s, actually before that I should say, so as a young man in the 1920s, he traveled to Paris and found work in the studio of, I think think many of you know this name, Konstantin Brancusi, a very important modern sculptor who's often credited with inventing abstraction in sculpture. Brancusi, originally Romanian artist, who was at the center of modern art, Paris at the time, didn't take any assistants or apprentices, so Noguchi was the only one who was able to work in the studio of Brancusi's. After about 6 months, he traveled across Siberia and ended up in China with the intention of going back to Japan. This is in 1930. And then he got a letter from his father saying that if you come to Japan, do not use my family names. So, kind of broken. So he decided to stay in Beijing, but this turned out to be a challenge, turned out to be an opportunity. So he got to meet Qi Baishu, the ink master, and studied ink painting for 7 months. And plus actually have one of the ink paintings, I don't think they included in their PowerPoint. So that was a very important moment in China in the formative stage. Now, so then it goes on, and then what I would actually recommend at this juncture is for you to look at Noguchi Museum's website. It has an excellent chronology of the artist's work and life that you should use for your studies. So after, in the 1930s, and I think I mentioned some of this in my essay, I mean, he really had, it's like a Hollywood film life. In the 1930s, he spent some time in Mexico City, hanging out with all these communist artists, Frida Kahlo, Diego Rivera, you might have heard these names, Leon Trotsky, and then in the 1940s, he came back to Japan. And this is the really critical moment that I was going to get to. Many of you may know that when Japan invaded or bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941, and when Japan and the United States entered the conflict, the US government made the decision to incarcerate or intern Japanese Americans who are from the western states, so from the states of Hawaii, Washington, Oregon, and California, Arizona, United States. They were yanked out of their homes and they were put in concentration camps. There was one in Arizona, one in Arkansas, and I think there was one in Montana or something like that. So that was a moment of also political awakening for Noguchi as a half Japanese person, but because he was from East Coast, he wasn't subjected to incarceration, but he voluntarily decided to enter one of the concentration camps. We actually use the term concentration camps. The term is internment camps. And so he entered one of the camps, which was in Arizona, out of this idealism that he wanted to improve the tough life that these fellow Japanese Americans had to live in a camp in the middle of the desert, but also with the ideal that he could shape the earth to create a totally new kind of a utopian public space. So this was the sort of scale of ambition that Noguchi had, which didn't come to fruition. So he spent next several months trying to get himself out of the camp. But this was very, very important still experience that he had with the realization and also the kind of conflict between this modernist ambition, utopian idealism, and the force of politics, really. And that was such a critical moment for Noguchi. That was his important turning point in life in the 1940s. By 1950s, he's a celebrated artist. Now he's back in Japan. This is post Hiroshima, post Nagasaki. These pictures are taken from, as you can see in the caption, Hiroshima. So a few years after the end of the war, World War II, in 1945, he was invited to design something by a very important architect named Kenzo Tange, who was in charge of revitalizing this center of Hiroshima, which was completely obliterated by the atomic bomb. He designed a beautiful memorial for the dead in Hiroshima, but it was rejected by the city. Why? Because he's half American. So this kind of racial discrimination, prejudices, he experienced from both sides. But it didn't break him. He still managed to build certain monuments, such as this Peace Bridge that still stands in Hiroshima. Then as his career matured, then he began to get more and more public commissions for large landscaped gardens or sculpture gardens. This was the first major one that he realized at the UNESCO headquarters in Paris, what he called Japanese garden, although that Japaneseness is rather debatable, but still an amazing achievement in one of the major venues that you couldn't think of any bigger venues. Then he went on to design this beautiful sort of Euclidean geometry inspired garden, still there at Yale University. This is Beinecke Library, one of the libraries at Yale. And a bit later, he was actually around the same time, he got the commission for this new art garden or sculpture garden at the Israel Museum, which was timed with the opening of this museum. So the reason why I wanted to show you these examples is that, again, to illustrate his ambition wasn't just confined in making sculptures in the ground. He wanted to shape the earth, he wanted to sculpt the earth, and he wanted this earth sculptures, even before the term earth art, which began to emerge in the late 1960s, in the 1970s, Noguchi was already doing this before anybody else was. He is also known for these public spaces called playscapes, and I will have a chance to talk about this a little bit later. Not playground, but playscapes, as in landscapes, with a certain sculptural elements that were designed to activate not only children but adult imaginations. This is one partial playscape that was realized in Atlanta. Doing public landscaping or public art is infinitely more complicated than doing your own art because there are so many stakeholders, there are many rules and regulations and conflicting interests. So while Noguchi's desire to shaping the earth was there from the very beginning, relatively few have been realized. Of course, finance is another issue that came up. And this is the last one, as you can see, from the date 1988 to 2005, just outside of Sapporo. An expansive, you can't even call this playground, this is a gigantic park that he designed that was posthumously realized after his death. So I really want to emphasize the fact that Noguchi was more than just an artist, more than a sculptor. He was a designer, he was a landscape artist, he was a public artist, but also he was a public thinker. Towards the end of his life, so I guess at this point he was 84 years old, 83, 84 years old. He was selected to represent the United States in Venice Biennale in 1986, and this is what he decided to show. A slide that we can run, but also he filled the American Pavilion Gallery with this group of sculptures called akari. Akari being the Japanese word that means light. Something that he started making in the late 1950s out of what they are lanterns. You've all seen Japanese paper lanterns, but not in these forms. That he began to really experiment with bamboo ribbons and mulberry paper to create various kinds of symmetrical but also asymmetrical irregular shapes of many different scales as well. Some of them can be extremely large. In his lifetime, he ended up working with a very renowned paper lantern makers outside of Nagoya, and he designed about 200 of them, which are still commercially available. So you can buy them in the Noguchi Museum shop. But the whole idea here is that sculpture that can be owned by anybody, sculpture that can be collapsed, light as a sculptural material. So he really thought of sculpture in so many different ways: for play, for shaping the earth, for transportability. The traditional idea of sculpture is something that is finished and that sits on the floor or on the pedestal, and then you walk around like Michelangelo's David or something. That was completely challenged and undermined and retransformed and redefined by Noguchi throughout his career. Okay, so that was a very quick run through of Noguchi's life in 15 minutes. Going on to Yanbo, that's what it looks like. Just to give you a very quick highlight of, again, he's only in his early 40s, just entering, I would say, the mature stage of his career. But he really had a remarkable career in the contemporary art world and discourse over the last 10 years or so. A true breakthrough figure. Back in 2015, he was selected to represent his country, Denmark, and quickly showing you some of the installation views. I don't think this really kind of captures the part of the genius of this particular artist, who is able to create very airy but resonant installation where these various disparate objects that are found from different places really sing, and that they really have these kinds of echoes, so you can't really feel it with photos. Let's see, so these are images from the Guggenheim. So earlier this year, he was given, for those of you who have been to the Guggenheim Museum in New York, there is this incredible rotunda space with the spiral ramp going up 6 floors, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright back in the 1950s. To be given over this entire space is an incredible honor, but also a huge stress for an artist. I think Yanbo was one of the youngest artists who was given this opportunity and turned it into, again, very spare, just one object per day, or just a few small groups of objects together, going all the way up to the top on spiral ramp. An incredible installation. I think if you're interested, you should look up some of the reviews that have been published, and they have been incredibly appreciative of this exhibition. And this is the latest exhibition that is happening. You might have noticed the same exhibition title of the Guggenheim. So he took the part of the Guggenheim Museum exhibition and then brought it to this museum, SMK, National Gallery of Denmark, in his home city of Copenhagen, but completely different exhibition. I would just quickly point out this group of Noguchi's Akari lamps or sculptures that he installed, and then also this structure, an abstracted version of what's called Dome Pavilion. We'll come to that a little bit later. These have, as well as these round seat or bases. So just the way that he translated and adapted his New York exhibition at the Guggenheim to this Copenhagen exhibition, he's always taking one thing from the next and adapting it and morphing it. And this, I'm pointing these out because these are elements that you will find in the exhibition in Hong Kong at M+Pavilion. I just wanted to talk about just a few representative works by Yambo. This was a huge breakthrough, discussed extensively within Contemporary Art Press with this work. And then I don't know if you can see, but it's just a beautiful sort of old traditional longhand calligraphy in French. So you will find it in the work description. So this is a text from, I think, about 1860s, written by a French Jesuit missionary who was sent to Tonkin, which is nowadays northern Vietnam, to proselytize. So at the time, like many other Asian kingdoms that were resisting the Western incursions, either in military terms or cultural or religious terms, there was an edict against the activities of proselytization, Christian activities. So after, and this particular French missionary named Jean Bernard, after a couple of years of Christian activities was captured, sentenced to death by dismemberment, and executed. Now, I needed to tell this story because the artist, Yambo, his family is Catholic. Still, many people in Vietnam are Catholic. This is a sort of legacy of French colonization. And he's not a practicing Christian, but that's the culture that he grew up in. So part of his art practice is to look at not only his own biography and family's history, but also, especially in this early part of his career, to look at history of Vietnam as well. But instead of, say, making artwork that is very explicitly critical of colonialism, what he did here is to go to the archives of an organization in Paris called the Mission Étranger, which means French missions. So it's an organization, a Christian organization for training and organizing expeditions of Christian missionaries to Asia. An organization that has been in existence since the 18th century. And what you find there partly is all these missionaries who were martyred, and that there is this rather morbid tradition of the missionaries, those who survive, bring back the relics of those who were executed or martyred. So sometimes it's hair, sometimes it's the torture tools that were used to execute the missionaries, and then you always depict the gory image of how they were dismembered and killed. Because this is part of sort of how one becomes, I guess, goes to heaven. And then the Mission Étranger as the organization has the responsibility of documenting the lives and deaths of these missionaries. And in fact, this, like I'm pointing to it, and you're like, what are you pointing at? So the saint that I was just referring to, Théophane Bernard, is now a saint, and he was officially made a saint, I think, back in the 1980s. And what Yambo did is that he went into the archives of this organization and found this letter that Théophane Bernard wrote on the eve before his execution to his father. So in French text, it's a very florid 19th century language that says, God is the gardener who sows the seeds in the garden, in his garden, to see flowers blossom, but he also decides what to keep and what to cut down and then mine it. So like he's making this comparison of himself as flower who's about to cut down, i.e. about to be beheaded. So Jan Vo found this letter. Then this is where things become conceptual. Yambo's own father, who is of an older generation but doesn't speak any French, but because you may all know that Vietnamese actually uses Latin script, and it doesn't have its own script, and that's part of the legacy of colonization. So Yang Bo's father, Feng, having been educated in the older generation, has a beautiful calligraphic skill with Latin alphabets, even though he doesn't understand English or French. So what Yang Bo decided to do is to ask his father to transcribe the original French text from 19th century into a text that he can reproduce again and again and again. So this is an edition work, but each one handmade by artist's father, theoretically available until his death. So you write a check to his father's address, and he makes one and then send it back to you. So this whole idea of using your own father's skill, using him as labor, but also giving him a job, and then they're really kind of playing with this idea of what does it mean to replicate the same work again and again and again. But that's also connecting to, of course, the original author, Théophane Benard's relationship to his own father. Make sense? Maybe not. Okay. Then in the same year, he made this work, which is what it looks like. It is an old chandelier, grand chandelier from 19th century. This is in fact one of 4 that exists. So this is a chandelier that is taken from the grand ballroom of Hotel Majestic in Paris. Now it is a Peninsula Hotel, it's been bought by Peninsula. But back in the 1970s, it was one of the grandest 5-star hotels in Paris. And in 1975, that was where North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the US got together and signed a treaty to end the war in Vietnam. The war that Americans call Vietnam War, the war that Vietnamese call American War. So Yang Bo was living in Paris at the time, and he got the information that this hotel was about to be closed down. And I think it was Qataris bought it and turned it into his own way, something like that. So he managed to convince some people to buy these chandeliers from that location, historically extremely important location that sort of determined the fate of Vietnam, and then managed to acquire these 4 chandeliers and then decided to keep them as simply his own artworks. What this slide doesn't show is that he took those 4 chandeliers but treated them differently. This is the version that just is kept as it is. Another version has been taken all apart into hundreds of pieces, and they are meant to stay in pieces. So he makes a different kind of sculptural decision. Yang Bo will be somebody who can be described as post-Duchampian, as in Marcel Duchamp, the inventor of ready-made. An artwork can be made out of an existing object, ready-made object. There's a long tradition of art making since the early 20th century. Yang Bo will be of that lineage, somebody who works with found objects. Okay. Oh, there's one more work that I wanted to highlight. And then he went on to create this incredible project called We the People. So I needed to mention that idea of ready-made. So We the People, coming from that sort of famous poem that represents America as a nation of immigrants. And you may notice that this is, I don't know, is it recognizable? Okay, I will just explain. So this project is to reproduce the Statue of Liberty that stands in New York Harbor to 1:1 scale. So Statue of Liberty is about 50 meters tall from foot to the top of the torch that she holds. And this is exactly to 1:1 scale. part of the inspiration came from the artist discovering that the thickness of each of these plates is just as thick as 2 American pennies put together, which is about 2.5 millimeters. So when the original Statue of Liberty was produced, I don't know if everybody knows the story, it was a gift, France's gift to the United States for its 100th birthday, for its centennial. In 1876, it was designed by a sculptor named Frederic Auguste Bartholdi, made in Paris. You should all look Google because there are incredible images that you can find of Statue of Liberty standing in Latin Quarter in Paris. Put together there, taken apart. It was made with this copper plates that have been hammered, or the technical term is a repoussé. You hammer it from behind to push it into shape. 250 pieces created, shipped over to New York Harbor, and they're riveted together into shape. That's the original Statue of Liberty. So Yangbo's idea was to make them as practically and cheaply as possible, which meant that he had to do it in China. Also in 250 pieces, but not bring them together ever. So now these 200-some pieces are in various private and public collections around the world. A kind of a metaphor of what the Statue of Liberty was, which is the sort of first nation of democracy, which became global superpower, but also military superpower. Where is that ideal in pieces? That would be a very sort of simple way of explaining this incredible project. And M+ is very lucky to have, I think, the largest contiguous group of pieces. So we own this work in the collections, which are 10 separate pieces that are put together. So when you put them together, it looks like this, but it can also be in pieces on the floor. So what this is this part that holds like a torch. So the artist is especially delighted that M+ has the armpit of the Statue of Liberty. Okay, but let's go. I think I spent a lot of time. So that kind of gives you a flavor of the two different biographies, two different kinds of practices. One of 20th century, this sort of grand, almost macho, modernist practice versus this much more subversive kind of way of addressing different histories and cultures and biographies. But I wanted to talk about this concept of family or adoption, or adopting, perhaps is a better word, to explain why these artists together. Two artists who never met together. And a simple answer is that it wasn't myself as a curator saying that you, Yangbo, will have an exhibition with Isam and Noguchi. It was more that when I started discussing or discovering that Yangbo actually has been exploring Noguchi's life and work deeply in the recent years. He started out by being really fascinated with Akari. Again, that sort of unconventional definition of what sculpture is. He got really obsessed with it. That picture that I showed you, a recent exhibition where he hung dozens and dozens of Akari. I think it really kind of shows you the level of obsession that he has of Noguchi. So it was really Yangbo's suggestion that he would like to bring Noguchi and the Noguchi Museum to organize an exhibition at M+, which we decided to oblige. But it also made sense because, again, in our mind, Yangbo and Noguchi are already what we would call anchor artists. Two artists, international global artists, but with very complicated and deep connections to Asia in general. Really makes sense for M+'s purview and identity. So for those two artists to be put together makes perfect institutional sense. But I had to think a little further about what is the relationship really between these two artists. Just because Jan was obsessed with Noguchi doesn't really give enough of a reason. So there has to be more of a cultural, curatorial, intellectual reasoning or rationale behind it. But I just wanted to quickly remind you that no serious artists are islands. All artists think of their own practice and art in relation to who came before, because you always think of your place in history, and you always think about your legacy. So I'm just very quickly showing you this now legendary or mythical stories of mutual respect, rivalry, emulation, sometimes one-upmanship, love and hate, friendship, all of those things. There are many, many stories in the history of modern art, famously Pablo Picasso and Matisse, who really respected each other, but were highly competitive of each other. Just quickly illustrating, Matisse is a bit older, but their careers were in parallel, but also diverged greatly. As you can see from these quick examples. But even more interesting example might be between Picasso and Braque. Around 1909 to about 1914, two of them almost shared a studio together to so-called invent Cubism. And there's a very famous quote by Picasso that simply says, "Braque, she's my wife." That's how close they were, how intense their relationship was for a few years. And then, of course, there is really a story that is made to be Hollywood film, which became a Hollywood film. People like Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, and here, of course, they also obsessively depicted themselves and their relationships. A little bit of gossip here is that I just mentioned that Noguchi hung out with Kahlo and Rivera for a while in Mexico City in the 1930s, and it's said that Kahlo and Noguchi also had an affair. So, part of modern art history is many myths and many gossips. But then from there, I'm going to some of Yanbo's early works. So from the same year that he produced the two works that I showed you. So this is, again, found objects, ready-made sculpture. You see what they are, a washing machine, a refrigerator, a TV, and a wood cross. These were the things that his grandmother received when she arrived as a refugee in Germany from Christian charitable organization. So this sort of perverse idea that this is what you need as a refugee, of course you can understand the goodwill, of course. You need the accoutrements of modern convenience of modern life, and your religion. So this is what Jan's family, I guess, the two branches ended up in two different countries, one in Denmark and one in Germany. So this is grandmother who ended up with the German branch of the family. Things that she lived with for the remainder of her life, and then he inherited and turned it into a kind of totem, a memorial to his grandmother. Sort of counter-perverse idea that you will take them and turn it into a monument to your family member, which he then turned it into a tombstone. So this is actually a stone sculpture that he carved in the shape of this. Then he also made this work, Tombstone for Tongbo. Tong is his father. He's not dead yet, because he's still making those works. But this sort of perverse idea that he will make this tombstone, first of all, in the collection of a museum at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. And the part of the agreement is that when his father dies, and his father already has a plot in a cemetery in Copenhagen, the museum will send this to be the real tombstone. But in exchange, we'll receive some of his heirloom, like a Rolex watch, upbringing, like very important things. So, again, inserting your own family's history and relationship into the mechanisms of institution. What does institution do? Like when you acquire the most important art object of the time and you preserve it for perpetuity, right? But here, it's an agreement that will change that status. You take this object, but then when artist's father dies, we have to give this up, but we get something else in return. So it's really it's an interesting concept that really challenges the assumptions and the practices of how institutions behave. So, but then I wanted to show these examples to say how this idea of artists as this genius, as this mythical figure that's whose creativity just comes out sui generis, just out of himself or herself, that he is involving his own family history and family members as part of art making. Okay, so here's an example, maybe very quickly, because I'm going much longer than I thought. A beautiful installation that he did in Artist Space in New York. Completely open installation, light with this beautiful translucent curtain embroidered with botanical patterns that were drawn by another French Jesuit missionary who was sent to Tibet. He was a botanist, and then so these patterns are taken from this Christian missionary scientist. What's behind, do I have better pictures? Yeah. And then you go close to the curtain, you realize that there are these beautiful pictures. And then you realize by reading text that these are pictures that were taken surreptitiously, secretively, by an American anthropologist who was stationed in Vietnam during the war in the 1960s and 70s. So he was an anthropologist who was sent as kind of a counterinsurgency researcher, but he was also secretly gay. But he obviously in that context couldn't come out, couldn't express his sexuality. So in his free time, he will go around and then find these men, and he was also an amateur photographer, found these young men who are holding hands, and then you may all remember that many cultures, the idea of men holding hands didn't necessarily mean anything sexual. It was more expression of friendship or sociality. Same here, but then this American man, for him, this was a way of projecting his longing and his desire onto others as well. And the reason why I needed to tell this story is because these pictures taken by the man named Joe Carrier, Yambo met him by accident in Los Angeles, became friends. So Joe's now in his 80s, so this was about 10 years ago, in his 70s. After they became friends, Mr. Carrier shared these beautiful photos, and then Yambo, out of deep trust that was formed between two of them, is now going to be the executor of the estate when Mr. Carrier dies. So these photos will forever be preserved because of their friendship, almost the adoption into Yambo's own conceptual family. And the last example that I have is this artwork that he created, made out of knickknacks, these little souvenirs, thousands of them, collected by a Chinese-American artist named Martin Wong, an incredible painter who died in 1999 from AIDS, originally from San Francisco. And Yambo is an admirer of Martin Wong's work, and then became a devotee, but also very close friends with Martin Wong's mother, named Florence. I mean, there's a really fascinating story that I could just go on and tell, because Florence is Florence's family is originally from here, from Bordeaux, while Martin Wong was born in San Francisco. But anyway, so there is this kind of connection to our part of the world. So Florence, who was so dedicated to her only son, so you can kind of imagine losing your only son to AIDS, was completely dedicated the rest of her life to preserving Martin's legacy. And then Yang Bo discovered that she not only kept Martin's artworks, but just thousands of little funny knickknacks that Martin had collected. So what Yang Bo managed to do is to come to an agreement with Florence, Martin Wong's mother and executor of that estate, to turn this into an artwork, thus preserving what will be thrown away, what will have no value. And Florence recently passed away a couple of years ago, but now it is part of a museum collection through Yang Bo's own gesture of defining it as an artwork. Okay, so should I take 15 more minutes? Okay, 10 more minutes? Okay, so that very quickly go on. So I needed to sort of kind of give you that to discuss what counterpoint is. So just in few words, I'm flashing this image of Edward Said, one of the most celebrated literary critics, who also passed away maybe about 15 years ago already. Palestinian-born, British educated, but was a teacher, professor at Columbia University for many, many years. Very well known for a groundbreaking book of criticism called Orientalism, which is a study of especially British and French literature and scientific writings on the Orient or Asia. One of the first thorough study and critique of that tradition. But Said was also a lover and critic of music, and he developed this concept of counterpoint. So counterpoint is a musical term that denotes multiple melodies, two or more melodies that are independent, but sometimes come in harmony, and then they go off in harmony, but always remaining independent of each other. They can be mutually existing and complementing, but they maintain their own melodies. So often associated with Renaissance music or Baroque music, like Handel, Bach, or Palestrina, but also continues into the Romantic period of Beethoven, Schumann, and all of that. And so Edward Said took that idea of counterpoint to describe the classical literature, especially of British and French of the 19th and early 20th century, to describe that even if the story is describing the reality of metropolis, Paris or London, there is always the undertone, or hidden in the shadow, is the realities of colonies. The black bodies or colored people are always in the background. Even if they're not the main characters, they're always there as a cultural element. So what he meant to say is that center is always in the periphery. Peripheries is always part of the center. Metropolis is not there without colonies, and colonies are nothing without metropolis. So they are interdependent of each other. So the inspiration that I'm getting from Said is that both Noguchi and Yang Bo, whose biographies that I described as structured by displacement from the beginning, but they themselves desired and succeeded in being successful artists in metropolises, in New York and in Western Europe, but their work is always about decentering that discourse. There's always the other cultures from peripheries that creep into their work. but in totally different ways. In Noguchi's work, things are resolved in very modernist way. In Yangbo's work, it's there as fragments, as fractures. So, partly the way that we are embodying the concept of counterpoint, two separate melodies that are sometimes coming together, is to also expanding beyond our typical parameter of exhibition. So this is a simplified map of M+ gallery, you all recognize. That looks a little funny. It seems a little bit turned around. Okay. But anyway, you go up the step and here's the M+ gallery. Oh no, this way. Okay. Normally you come clearly we have to fix the map because I can't read it. You come up the step and then you go into the gallery. This is typically where our exhibitions take place. This is an indication of what, remember I pointed out something called Dome Pavilion in a previous exhibition. We're creating our own version as a kind of sort of central structure within here. But we are also creating two container display spaces outside the back of the pavilion. So again, this is the back. You all know that's where the car park is essentially. We are putting two modified containers to provide further exhibition spaces. This element is mainly Yangbo's contribution as an exhibition element. The gallery will be kept completely open other than this. We're building no temporary walls, no exhibition furniture. About 30 Noguchis works will be installed here with just a few small Yangbo's works, and the rest of Yangbo's works will be installed here. I will also draw your attention to this plain sculpture that I will show you very quickly. Now, the gallery part of the exhibition is inspired by, I think the one thing that I also this is the juncture maybe I should now introduce, that one of the ambitions for this exhibition is to work with another institution, right? The Noguchi Museum in New York. So I'm also working with my co-curator. His name is Dakin Hart, and he's a senior curator, Noguchi specialist, obviously. And it's a thanks to his conception. So he wanted to, I mean, you could choose many works from Noguchi. You could go in so many different directions. How Dakin proposed as a kind of conceptual structure for selecting Noguchi's works is to think about the leitmotif of Chinese scholar's art, which is of course a long practice tradition in Chinese painting. Here's a little scholar's pavilion, a place of respite, a place of reflection, a place to commune with nature and the forms in the nature. So this serves as the inspiration for not this particular work, but this leitmotif in Chinese painting, almost imagining Yangbo as a scholar. So this is just a rough, again, a floor plan, just to simply show how things are going to be placed, just to give you an indication of how things will be strewn about. But all the installation will ultimately be decided on the spot with the artist. Again, a kind of experimental thing that we are doing. We haven't done things like this before. Now that I'm going to very quickly go through all these works, because to talk about individual works would take hours. You do have a lot of write-ups and information. You will get additional information on these works. But the following are the 32, I think, works by Isamu Noguchi. The idea here is to cover the entire career from 1920s to 1980s. So starting from 1928 1942, I will just quickly say a few words. Noguchi was very much interested in not just art, but also science and technology, already visible in this geometric form. I talked about how Noguchi was ambitious enough to always imagine shaping the earth, sculpting and carving the earth. already evident in this 1942 work, which is called Tortured Earth. This demonstrates the wide range of material interests as well. You can see here that he's using moldable plastic, an aluminum sculpture, or simple sticks of wood, all in the 1940s. So, kind of going back in time, this is a breakthrough moment in 1928, soon after his time in Constantin Barbuse's studio in Paris. Before he was a figurative sculptor, he sculpted people's portraits, then he turned into an abstract artist. One of his works will be shown. The so-called worksheets for sculpture, he made many of them in the 1940s to again newly imagine what sculpture can be. Not a form that is carved or molded, but cut into different pieces that can be joined together. So these are assemblable and disassemblable, originally made in wood, but now a bronze form. Noguchi was also an industrial designer, which is another part that makes him very unique from his contemporaries in modern art, because this is a time that artists were aspiring to be a pure painter, or pure sculptor, or pure architect. And he was always, perhaps a reflection of his own origin, was all about hybridization. So he designed this nurse radio and guardian ear, so this is the baby monitor, essentially. Early form of baby monitor, which is beautifully designed, technically failed, but we're happy to have a copy in our collection, as well as this dining table set that we also have an example in the M+ collection. So, already spoke about Akari, another new definition of what sculpture can be. We are showing two examples in the exhibition gallery, but he created in collaboration with a very well-known, one of the major Japanese designers of post-war period called Isamu Kenmochi, this bamboo basket chair, which is also in the M+ collection. Ceramics was also part of his vocabulary. These lovely, cute things that he made, little ghost and little dog, as well as a vase are also included. I mean, I'm sure all of his sculptures were like his children, so he didn't favor any of them, but it is known that he especially loved his Japanese ceramic works, so we're lucky to have some of those. What Noguchi is probably best known is as a stone sculptor. But the reason why I needed to include all of these works leading up to the later period, this is already in 42, is to really show the range, other aspects of Noguchi's career. So what I will quickly show is also to focus on different kinds of stone. Not all stones are the same. It can be an alabaster, it can be a granite, it can be marble, it can be basalt, or andesite, or jasper. They're all of different materiality, density, and texture, and palette. So in the exhibition, we really wanted to show the whole range of it. I mean, of course, Noguchi's stone sculptures can be much, much larger, but we don't have space for it. But we've done our best, but also sculpture like obsidian. So here's another example where that stone that turns into a percussive device, a musical device, which we cannot allow. So this is important for Docent to hear. We cannot allow the general visitors to do this, but we'll figure out a way that helpers and docents can perhaps play when we have certain groups, or anyway, we're encouraged to play, but we can't just have everybody just looking at it. What is lesser known about Noguchi's sculpture is this more metal sculptures, starting already from this one in the late 50s called Black and Blue, made out of aluminum. So of course aluminum is cheaply available, often industrial material. The idea that one could get the aluminum sheets and shape like origami into a form was just unimaginable for modernist art in this time period. By the 1980s, he would go even further, taking galvanized steel. Galvanized steel is really that material they use for water pipes and in Hong Kong letterboxes. Like a postal boxes used to be made out of galvanized steel because it's a really hardy material that is water resistant and weather resistant. But the idea of taking something so utilitarian functional and turning it into various sculptures. These are edition sculptures, so they're not unique either. He originally intentioned to be as cheap as possible. So this whole idea of democratization of art, broadening access to art, either in the form of sculpted public spaces or akaris that anybody can have in their living room, or these are more expensive but still much more affordable than stone sculptures, for instance. And this was a very important strength for Noguchi as well. So we are including, I believe, 6 examples, and then ending with plain sculpture. So this is an infinitely available example. They're simply made out of 6 sewer pipes. So these are off-the-shelf pipes available in the United States. Originally, we actually wanted to explore equivalent in Hong Kong because that would be actually more in spirit, in keeping with Noguchi's spirit. Because he really wanted to just take, giant. So each one is shaped like this. It's called long elbow pipes, and he put them together up and down to create the undulating shape, and then spray painted it. That's just how you make this. So this is an installation view just outside of San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. We are getting one of these, and they will be installed just behind the containers. And the plan is to keep it there indefinitely. Okay, so last few images. Okay, so this is just a rendering of one of the akaris. This is one of the largest and the most uniquely shaped akaris by Noguchi, which is just two-dimensional. So it's just one side with this triangular shapes coming out. This is our version of the Dong Pavilion. Oh, I didn't explain what Dong Pavilion is actually. So Dong is the name of one of the minorities in China, one of the 52 recognized minorities. And Dong people mainly live in Guizhou and Guangxi. And Jan, a few years ago, traveling through the region, discovered this incredible vernacular architectural form that you can see in Dong villages, Dong people's villages, which are the focal point and gathering point on each village. So this is where people will just gather. And then he abstracted that form as an exhibition element. So this idea of discovering these ingenious forms from different places, and forms is an important aspect of Jan's practice, which he wanted to incorporate here as a stand for Noguchi's sculpture. So, and then why does it look so squat? Because we have a very low ceiling. So we're keeping the structure, but we decided to make it fit. We had to reduce the height of the roof section, but we had to keep this section at the original dimension because we also had to fit the PL2. This is called model PL2 akaris, but this also demonstrates the sculptural solution according to Yambo, which he, as he always says, as practical as possible. He actually likes to work within limits, and then how the given limits that you cannot change create a new kind of a solution. Something of course modernist artists would never do. For them it is about their vision all the way. Okay, so these are the kinds of works that we're going to, well, these are all the works we're going to include by Yang Bo. I talked a lot about the French Jesuit missionaries of the 19th century. This is the portrait of some of them he found in the same archive, simply reproduced as print. This is a very interesting web, and if you can see it, a gory picture of dismemberment of French Jesuits in Vietnam in the 19th century. This is based on a painting that actually exists in the Museum at Hangzhou in Paris that I was talking about, the Jesuit missionary organization. Then I said earlier that you document martyrdom. That's part of their job. So the story here is that the original martyrdom was documented by a local painter in Vietnam in silk painting. Then the original got lost, so that it was reproduced as an oil on canvas painting back in Paris. So the idea here is that Yan Bo took that image and asked 6 Chinese painters to reproduce into silk painting. So bringing the original back to Asia. So we're taking one of those recent silk painting reproductions of a reproduction of the original in this exhibition. Here's artist's high school photograph, self-portrait. And there is a description of what this work is. A little Pekingese dog called Ludi, one of Queen Victoria's many pet dogs that was allegedly found found in the Beijing Summer Palace during its destruction by the joint British and French forces as part of the Second Opium War in 1860. So a British military officer found this dog hiding in a little closet, took it back to the UK, gave it to Queen Victoria, who named it Luti. It's coming from loot, it's destroy. So it's a kind of sort of funny retort on the whole history of colonialism, of course. A little bird cage that he found in a market in Guangdong, which turned into an edition artwork. Story of Cinderella in original German, but Grimm Brothers version. We all know about what Cinderella's story is, 2 evil sisters. The original Grimm Brothers version actually has the 2 sisters cut off their own toe as well as heel to fit their foot into the glass shoe. So if you read actually Grimm Brothers original versions, many other fairy stories, they're actually pretty brutal. Often they're very bloody, but our modern 20th century version has sanitized many of them. Artist finds that story to be almost like symbolizing determination, and how he talks about it is that if you're an immigrant, in order to survive in new society, you'll do all kinds of things like cutting off your own toe. So that work here reproduced in the artist's father's beautiful handwriting in gilded. More recently, he has been collecting these various ancient or medieval sculptures, Roman or medieval sculptures, violently cutting them, sectioning them, but then often putting them in these little boxes. I think so. Many of them are like a carnation milk boxes and things like these. It's just putting this what we now think of as a precious statues into the packaging of modern day global commodities. Unfortunately, we are not able to show our We the People, so we are borrowing this little piece, which comes obviously from the year the Statue of Liberty, which is included here. Another body of work that the artist has been producing a lot is this just found cardboard boxes that have been gilded. Here are a couple of examples of in sort of medieval wood statue, which are presented as an artwork. A found image from, this will take a long time to explain, from a personal archive of one of the astronauts in the Apollo mission that he acquired. And then finally, two most recent works along the same line of taking found Roman statues, often cutting them, but also hybridizing them by putting two incongruent parts together. These two are what we think of as actually a second batch of work. That this exhibition has a very long run. It will run for 5 months. We have made the decision to extend our exhibition periods a little bit longer as we get closer to the opening of the museum. We want to slow down the pace of our exhibition, but also with such major efforts to bring in loans from another museum, loans from the artist's own collection, and producing many exhibition elements, we felt that we really want to have this exhibition available for a much longer period. So this will run until late April. And the artist's proposal by Yangbo here is to have a bit of a refresh. So around January, some new works will be introduced. These will be 2 new works that will be added to the installation. And we should have description of these works as part of your package. Okay, reminder again, we have 2 more training sessions, which you are highly encouraged or obligated to attend. Sorry that ran very long, but do we have time for questions? Yes.
So thanks Doryun for sharing this 2 artists. That's a very great presentation. So now we have some time for Q&A session. So anyone want to ask a question? So anything you want to share?
Thank you very much for explaining the details of the artist and also the background. I think it definitely helped. And I find it's very interesting is because when you explain the works and also the space, is the gallery actually will be quite peaceful in a way, like a scholar garden, very zen, very like Japanese garden sort of concept. While we're looking down to young folks like sculpture collection, actually we almost immediate action is, oh, it's quite aggressive or like quite cruel or taking parts of things. So the contrast is quite big. So I was just wondering the whole idea how these two like go together and like accompany as one exhibition. While we actually talking to the visitors, actually what we want to present, why is there such a big contrast?
Yeah. So you know, it is. So this is. In a sense, I'm still ruminating on it, to be honest. You know, it is not a kind of an exhibition where I have a very clear sense of these 2 artists are interesting as formal affinities or contrasts, or because they actually have, you know, like, for instance, if I were to do like a Picasso Braque exhibition, you know, there's a clear history where they were together, where their formal language developed together and then diverged. You know, that's one typical way of doing a 2-person exhibition. But here, again, I kind of sort of followed the artist's own intellectual universe or decision, right? So Yangbo looking at sort of this grandfather generation's artists, and that sort of unexpectedness that you wouldn't necessarily expect that an artist like Yangbo will be looking at Noguchi, but once I heard that totally makes sense. And so this is what my statement is trying to explain, that there are different moments and different forms of displacement that they explain, they experience, that is the drive or the motor of their artwork, and their practice. But they are also products of very different time. Thus, Noguchi's, while he was constantly experimenting with forms and materialities, but it's always about some kind of a resolution. It is about completion. While Yangbo is completely the opposite. It is about making what is already complete is sometimes incomplete. Sometimes in a very violent way, sectioning or putting them together. But when you actually see the objects, I am confident that you will all feel that instead of sort of making you comfortable or horrified, they actually often have this amazing aura to it. And that's, to me, the magic of sort of Yanbo's way of making work, that you may be just taking an everyday cardboard box and simply gilding it, but it's not because a gold was applied to it, but then he has a way of turning something into a fetish. In fact, actually, he's an artist who can create fetish. And what I mean by fetish is like that traditional idea of religious fetish. Right? It's something that is imbued with spirit, something that is animated. So the garden, the gallery, yes, we do hope will feel much more meditative, much more poetic, mostly with Noguchis works. Yanbo's works, so it was kind of the final decision. Originally, Yanbo's works were going to be only in the container and containers outside, and that was his decision. He, in fact, said that I want Noguchi to be in a proper gallery. I want to be in a container, as if his works have been packed up. And then I think he never said it like this, but I think he's also thinking about what Hong Kong is. Traditionally, a port city, a trade city, not so, we're not so far from that, in fact, container port. And I don't want to overemphasize this part, but I think his family biography is also part of it, right? This will be one of the few exhibitions that he has done in Asia to date, not so far from Vietnam. And the fact that his family was rescued by a container ship, I think this is a kind of a reference that he doesn't want to say out loud, but I think it's there when he says that I want to be in a container. So I think he intentionally wanted to create a much more serene installation that would happen in the gallery, and then the kind of sort of down and dirty installation that he wants to do with more sort of aggressive aspects of his practice.
Thanks, Doryun. Maybe it's not really a question, it's probably I have some observation, maybe you can see if you agree or not.
Okay.
Because before today, I was like, okay, so you're putting Yanbo and Noguchi together. It's kind of funny because for me, Yanbo's work rely heavily on narrative and the story behind the object. And it really, because you don't get it when you first look at it, you have to really read and stories and everything. And then Noguchi is pretty much visual. Right? So it's there. You see it, you get it. And not saying that it's bad or good. Right? So for me, I was very curious how you could actually link the two together.
Yeah.
So up to today, what my take on this is actually it may be actually Yanbo's scheme to actually make it into his exhibition, but using Noguchi as a vehicle or using Noguchi as a found object of his own show. Like for example, maybe he sees Noguchi as another Joseph Carrier, or maybe he sees Noguchi as another missionary in another sense. I don't know. Just it seems to me a little bit more like. Because he identified with things, so he was openly gay, so that he takes Joseph Carrier very, very kind of in a personal level, and then he takes all the identity things, immigration, and kind of use that displacement, and maybe that's also related to heavily to Noguchi. I don't know, just some kind of thought.
Okay, so there are two parts to what you're saying. So we'll come back to the second part of this forming relations as an important aspect of Yale's practice. I will come back to that later. The first part that you mentioned, I think it's a great place to look at and interpret the exhibition, and I love the observation that you made, partly because I don't agree with it. But partly I agree with it. I think, yes, that's how I sort of described it, right? Like, Noguchi's formal language is about bodiless resolution. Things are resolved into complete forms versus Yambo, which is about really decentering and destabilizing, and sometimes violently cutting and sectioning and organizing. But I say that I disagree with it because you may think that you see Noguchi's forms and that, oh, it is just forms, and then you get it, you appreciate it as it is. But in fact, I think there are many stories behind it as well. I think, for instance, where the rocks came from, and then they are not all carved either. Sometimes he would just pick up things that the stonemasons were just sharpening their tools, and they say that that's an artwork. So he was also doing this whole very Duchamp-inspired ready-made kind of things, but you wouldn't necessarily know that if you didn't read about it, right? If you didn't read how the whole galvanized steel sculptures came about, and what are the kinds of technical means that he added to it, then you will lose a lot of meaning to it. So even if it is seemingly primarily formal, I think there's many other stories that you can tell, you can read about. Reversely, Yambo's work, yes, I mean, you feel like, okay, like, you have to read about how this object came from 16th century Mexico, and, like it was traded around the world, whatever, it certainly changes your, deepens your understanding, changes your first observation, but I would actually argue that sometimes, you don't have to even have that information, that he actually knows how to place object to inspire curiosity for people. Whether you actually have to read about their origins, how it was shipped around or whatever, I think that's up to the viewers, up to the interpreters. So I wouldn't necessarily make that very clear binary between something that you get immediately visually and then something that you have to intellectually understand. I think it can go in either direction. Do you see what I mean? Now about the second part of it, I see where you're coming from. So like his relation forming with Joe Carrier or Martin Wong, of course, there's a certain affinity that we can perhaps easily assume that the artist or gayness, and then his affinities with gay artists or closeted gay men to Vietnam War. But I think that that's a bit simplistic. I think that the kind of trust and friendships that he develops are a bit more than that, and I don't think it's. I know that you don't mean it necessarily that way, but others have said that this is an artist who really just finds people's legacy or people's work as a ready-made and simply presents it. But people are not so easily instrumentalized like that. Or taking on the responsibility of being the executor of somebody's estate, even when a person dies. It is based on a very, very deep engagement and trust. And I would just finish. And then his now engagement, relationship with even adopting Noguchi into his universe of human relations, historical relations, is a bit different. So to be perfectly frank, I don't quite know where that comes from yet. So this whole structure, the conceptual structure that I'm setting up, as two examples of people of two different times and cultures that have been displaced is sort of my imposition, my interpretive imposition. The artist doesn't talk about it like that. Yangbo is not a kind of an artist who just explains and writes about his intentions. And of course I asked, like, this is how I made it, and you said, okay, that sounds good, So it is really just like my particular kind of a lens. And I'm highly conscious of the fact that there's something very institutional in the way that I'm presenting, at least externally, Noguchi as the quintessential internationalist modern artist of the 20th century, and then Yangbo as quintessential 21st century nomadic conceptual cosmopolitan artist. That's a lot of words, but that's but at the same time, that's really fixing these two artists into certain kinds of categories. But that does help in a conceptual way why these two artists are put together. I think they represent fluidity with which they moved around different milieus and contexts. And that's what makes these two people extraordinary.
Thanks, Doryun. I think you sort of mentioned a lot of concepts in the design of this exhibition. I wonder, out of the pieces that you've chosen when you're trying to place them into the exhibition space, what would be, for example, the logical or conceptual flow within, and how do we actually make reference of the two artists? Because if, for example, if you decide to place them in two different dimensions of space, then making references would be rather difficult for laymen. And how would you suggest we look at this?
Two artists' works.
Correct, yeah. And the overall logical flow or the storyline flow of the overall region.
That's up to you. No, I'm serious, really. Like, we didn't design these exhibitions in the kind of typical comparative way that this form by Noguchi, this form by Yangbo together. We deliberately decided to be very open about not having kind of preconceived plan. The only intention with each artist is to represent as wide a variety as possible that we can manage in terms of budget, and in terms of the space and all of that. And then that's certainly very clear, definitely much more clear with Noguchi, because we're covering 60 years, all different kinds of materials. So that was the main purpose, or main decision in terms of how to select the works. With Yangbo, in a smaller scale, but in the same way. We also wanted to show as wide a range as possible. It's a fewer number of works, it's 15 versus 32, but that was partly practical and logistical, but also partly Yangbo wanted to also contain his own presence as well. So he's there in the installation of Noguchis Works. He's going to be installing all the works. So I can't really tell you exactly how they're going to be. They will be clustered in certain ways. So the final walkthrough is going to be very important for all of you. So, but this is a bit of a leap of faith, to be honest, maybe even a little bit of risk that we are taking by working with a contemporary artist who doesn't make installation decisions on floor plan. To somebody who makes the decision, and then actually what I expect is that when we go in there and start installing in about a week, is that he will see different meanings and symbols on the floor and start clustering them together. So, like, that doesn't give you comfort. So what we have done is to have as many work descriptions for works as possible for each one, because we know that the floor plan is totally open, which means that the works will be all strewn throughout the space. There are no walls to put easily the labels. So there are no labels in the exhibition, so don't panic yet. So the exhibition guide is, each work will actually be numbered, and then each work will have the number that you can match with the exhibition guide, with the work descriptions. Not all the works will have descriptions because it's too much for us to put 47 work descriptions. So I think we have about 30 of them. Yeah, around 30 of them. So, it's going to give a negotiation of how much you really want to say about individual artworks, or if you want to just cover a general concept and then let the viewers to, well, maybe I won't say much about that yet. I think we should actually go into the gallery and see. I think the overarching concept, I think it is more important to me than reading individual artworks in this exhibition.
Just to kind of follow up, that we're not alone in this. So in lesson 2 and 3, especially lesson 3, we're going to talk about, this time is very special that we don't have any sections. So when you come into the space, which is like, a scholarly room. And so in lesson 3, we kind of talk about how do you actually lead the tour with this kind of exhibition format. And we'll really help, to kind of discuss about this. And also Michelle from the Human Commons is going to lead in this and facilitate on this one. So it'll be pretty good that you can come to lesson 3, and then, as I said, and you guys not alone, we can talk about this.
Good. Yeah, time flies as and before you go, thank you, Doryun, for and before you go, we'd like to distribute a paper to you, and we want you to write down some questions you are in your mind that we don't have time to answer now, but we can collect your questions and then we can pass to Doryun. And in our lesson 4 walkthrough in the gallery, we will try to